Hey everyone, this is Glenn Greenwald. Welcome to a new episode of System Update here on our home on Rumble. The Russian war in Ukraine is escalating into a new stage. For the first week or so, the war was characterized by what even the harshest Russian critics recognize has been a fair amount of constraint. The refusal of the Russian military to use their air force or to use anywhere near their full military capability, and whether that was a miscalculation or a deliberate strategy. The reality is that Ukraine has not fallen, and even though a lot of Western intelligence experts predicted that it would quickly, and as a result, we are now starting to see an escalated strategy where Russia is starting to target the most populous cities in Ukraine with the intention of surrounding and entering them and bombing them, and that is going to, as it always does, create a lot more casualties, both military and civilian. And the ethos is now ready in the air, and we're going to start seeing it for the next several days, as evidenced by the New York Times page right as of this moment, where the big headlines blare: civilian toll rising in rocket attacks, 2 major strikes, 600,000 refugees have fled Ukraine. So this is the kind of messaging that we're going to be bombarded by over the next several days. Lots of videos showing Russians blowing things up in Ukraine, lots of stories about civilians being killed in large numbers, and that in turn is going to further intensify what is clearly the overwhelming anti-Russian sentiment in the United States and more broadly in the West. People who are feeding on a kind of nonstop, very homogenized diet of information that is being curated by them over social media that is entirely one-sided, and that is leading them more and more to intensify their anger and emotions toward Russia, which, whether valid or not, and I think in any time there's a war, not just this one, but the ones the U.S. fights, the ones fought with far less visibility, anger and horror are valid and healthy emotions. But clearly those emotions are intensifying and will continue to intensify. And that's happening right at the same time as there are growing calls in the US, in the UK, and more broadly in Europe for extremely reckless and dangerous policies, including having the United States and or NATO directly confront Russia militarily through creating a no-fly zone. In other words, having the United States and its NATO allies order Russia not to fly over certain areas of Ukraine. And obviously, the accompanying and implicit threat is that if you do so, our military will shoot down your planes or will attack your military units. In other words, to create a no-fly zone, as Ukraine is calling for, as more and more people in the West are advocating, would instantly mean direct war, a hot war, between the United States and Russia, the two countries with by far the largest nuclear stockpiles in the world. Now, this view is still a minority view. The problem, for sure, it's a minority view. The problem is that each day that goes by, when more and more not fringe or marginalized anonymous Twitter trolls or Facebook pages advocate this, but when prominent people embedded in mainstream institutions more and more come out and say, we, the West, cannot stand by and watch Ukrainian civilians being slaughtered by the Russian army without doing more, meaning intervening militarily, the more they're saying that, and the more and more of them every day, the more it starts to seem like a viable option. It's the classic Overton window, where a option that once was unthinkable or unspeakable, having the U.S. directly confront Russia militarily, is now being mainstreamed as a result of more and more people saying it. And the more and more people who say it, more and more people are led to believe it's a reasonable or viable option. While that happens, at the same time, people getting increasingly enraged over watching Ukrainian civilians being killed by Russian military action. You can see how volatile that is. The idea that we are not going to stand by as people who have spent huge amounts of money on this highly powerful and sophisticated military and just passively watch as the Russian army destroys Ukraine and kills huge numbers of people. The sentiment is very easily predictable. that public sentiment will start to insist that more be done, especially as people are being propagandized more and more aggressively in a closed system where there's almost no dissent, which is what's true in the United States discourse, that their emotions are so high that, as I talked about in the last video, by design, the higher you become in terms of your emotions, the more your capacity to reason is crowded out, the more you're guided by passion and anger and rage and sorrow and compassion, all emotions, the more your capacity for rationality is crowded out, and the more an option like that can start to seem instinctively desirable. So I think it's really worth looking at the trajectory of how this incredibly reckless proposal is being inserted into the mainstream. Because again, even though the major leaders like President Biden and the Pentagon and Boris Johnson and lots of journalists, their view still is this is a crazy idea. In the eyes of a lot of people, it's becoming less and less crazy because more and more people in prominent positions of mainstream authority are advocating it. The first example I want to show you is something that is absolutely stunning to listen to. It is Sir Richard Barons, who is a general in the British Army, a retired general, who once held one of the highest positions in the British military, the ex-head of the Joint Forces of Command. He's not some low-level soldier or someone they just kind of handpicked, but he is a major voice inside the British military. He went on the BBC News' flagship news show, Newsnight, last night and listened to what he said about the prospect of US or NATO or British direct military confrontation toward Russia.
It's Monday night. By Wednesday, Russian heavy artillery will be around these Ukrainian cities, and they may be firing indiscriminately and destroying large chunks of a city and killing civilians. And when they do this, they'll be 300 miles from the border with NATO and the European Union, a day's drive or half an hour in a military jet. So I think one of the issues for about Thursday, Friday this week is how does public opinion in the UK and other countries react to seeing people who look and live like us being slaughtered. And at that stage, I think there'll be a different conversation led by public opinion about the application of NATO military power, perhaps through the sky and definitely against heavy weapons.
Now, there's so many notable parts to that extraordinary video, beginning with how casual, almost sociopathic he is about just calmly discussing the possible eventuality very quickly that the United States will be, or the West will be, in direct military confrontation with Russia. I mean, he says it like he's almost bored. Like it's just a question of some bureaucratic choice instead of what would clearly be the most dangerous situation for the world since at least the Cuban Missile Crisis, if not ever. But note the other part of what he's doing, which is quite insidious and almost even clever, is he's suggesting that it's not Western leaders who will order this war, but public opinion, populations in the West will rise up and demand it. And he's saying that the reason that might happen is because they're forced to look not at Somalians or Iraqis or Afghans or Yemenis being killed, but instead, quote, people who look and live like us. Now, it's easy to demonize that as racist or xenophobic or whatever, and clearly there's a part of it that is. But I also think he's addressing something that's very real in human nature that is a part of why we are so engaged with and emotional about this war, even though plenty of other wars are at least as savage and brutal and horrific, ones involving our own governments or others, which we largely ignore. How much have you heard about the ongoing hideous war in Yemen involving the United States and the British governments and the Saudis and the Iranians? Almost nothing. I think part of what he's saying is that the reason why public opinion might be willing to confront Russia, even if it means a dangerous outcome like nuclear war in this case is because they care more, because these aren't people who seem distant from us, but are people who look like us. And it's just a tribalistic instinct that we have to work to avoid, that is very difficult, especially if we don't try, that is very much at play here. And I think it makes it a lot more dangerous that people have a lot more empathy for Ukrainians for the reason he's saying. Now, I'm going to come back to that point, but I just want to go through the other examples of just to show you how mainstream this idea has become. The first prominent American politician to advocate this was Adam Kinzinger, the Republican from Illinois in the Congress, who has become one of the most beloved members of Congress from the perspective of the media because he was an ardent Russiagator and loud anti-Trump voice from within the Republican Party. He and Liz Cheney are clearly the most popular Republican House members among the media. They were the two that were put on the January 6th committee with Nancy Pelosi for this reason. And Congressman Kinzinger, who's beloved for that and also because he has a military background, he just came out and said, look at what he said 3 days ago. The fate of Ukraine is being decided tonight, but also the fate of the West. Declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine at the invitation of their sovereign government. Disrupt Russian air ops to give the heroic Ukrainians a fair fight. It's now or later. History teaches that taking a stand is inevitable and gets more costly with time. We own the skies. Russia cannot hold a candle to our air power. Do this. Putin is too dangerous to hope he is satisfied with just Ukraine. Now, again, he got overwhelmingly criticized and attacked for advocating that because it's insane. It's nothing short of insane. The fact that he holds himself up as the responsible, moderate voice against Donald Trump, what has Donald Trump ever done or said that even come close to this level of sociopathy and just unhinged warmongering, calling for the United States to go and take over the skies of Ukraine and confront the Russian military directly over Ukraine? What is more insane than that Donald Trump has ever done or said? Nothing. And yet, look how many people are saying it now since Kinzinger did. First of all, it was right before Kinzinger came out with this where a member of the press asked Pentagon spokesman John Kirby in an obviously irritated way why President Biden hadn't yet ordered a no-fly zone. And here was a reporter, Valerie Insina, who is a Pentagon correspondent for Breaking Defense. She was present at the briefing. It wasn't she who asked the question, but she conveyed, quote, when asked why the U.S. NATO has not set up a no-fly zone in Ukrainian airspace, Kirby said that, quote, that's a policy decision at the nation-state level. He reiterates the administration's position to not deploy U.S. forces to Ukraine while at the same time strengthening NATO allies. That was the first time it was really mainstream when a journalist stood up in the Pentagon briefing and asked John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, why isn't President Biden ordering a no-fly zone? Then Congressman Kinzinger came out and explicitly advocated it. Here you have Richard Engel, the longtime chief foreign correspondent for NBC News, who covers war zones all over the world and is an extremely influential voice in NBC News, one of the most influential outlets in the West. And here's what he said yesterday, quote, perhaps the biggest risk calculation, moral dilemma of the war so far. A massive Russian convoy is about 30 miles from Kiev. The U.S. NATO could likely destroy it, but that would be direct involvement against Russia and risk everything. Does the West just watch in silence as it rolls? Clearly suggesting, if not explicitly advocating, that although it's very dangerous for the United States to go militarily confront the Russian army by, say, sending fighter jets to blow up that convoy, he's saying it's certainly worse, isn't it, for the West to just watch in silence and do nothing as those Russian trucks roll into Kiev. Clearly designed to advocate that. His colleague at MSNBC, Clint Watts, said something very similar, although even more explicit. He said, quote, this is yesterday, strangest thing, entire world watching a massive Russian armor formation plow toward Kiev. We cheer on Ukraine, but we're holding ourselves back. NATO Air Force could end this in 48 hours. Understand hand-wringing about what Putin would do, but we can see what's coming. How generous of him to acknowledge, even though he calls it hand-wringing, as though it's like a form of hysteria, that many people think this is crazy because it has a very high likelihood, not a certainty, but a high likelihood to lead to, global nuclear annihilation between the two countries with the biggest nuclear stockpiles. And remember, just 4 or 5 days ago, or 7 days ago, when Putin announced the invasion of Russia, the prevailing narrative was, this is not the same Vladimir Putin that has been governing Russia for 20 years. This is an insane version. He's taken leave of his senses. He no longer is constrained by rational thought. He's gone mad. He's like a mad despot, willing to do anything for glory and conquest and his legacy. So this idea that Putin would be way too responsible and constrained not only contradicts what they were saying just a week ago, but also when talking about global nuclear annihilation is not very comforting to be assured in that way. Here is Clint Watts' bio, his biography, that is, aside from working for NBC News, he's now a consultant, and before that, he served as a U.S. Army infantry officer, an FBI special agent, as the executive officer of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, a consultant to the FBI's Counterterrorism Division and National Security Branch, as well as an analyst supporting the U.S. intelligence community. So he's a kind of classic member of the U.S. security state, of the deep state. Shouldn't be surprising that he's now another voice. It shouldn't be surprising, first of all, that he works for NBC. They almost all do, or CNN. When they leave the deep state, that's where they go work, to cheat the news. But it certainly shouldn't be surprising that somebody like this is almost like Dr. Strangelove and like those mad generals who were almost eager for a nuclear war with Russia. Here is a columnist for the Mail, the British Mail, on Sunday, Dan Hodges, who this morning said, quote, "If people want to oppose a no-fly zone, fine. But understand that is an act of appeasement no different to our appeasement of Hitler in 1938. We are refusing to do what we know is morally right out of fear." Just your hysterical fear of nuclear war. "We are prepared to let a free nation die to safeguard ourselves." He thinks it's outrageous that we're not willing to engulf the planet in a nuclear holocaust when the cause of saving Ukraine is obviously important enough to go justify that. I don't know why, given how important he thinks this cause is, that he hasn't answered the call of the Ukrainian government for everyone to go over to Ukraine, be handed out free weapons, and fight against the Russian army. If he thinks this is such a urgent cause that we should risk nuclear war over it, I don't know why he's not doing that, why he's staying on Twitter writing these kind of tweets, pretending to be Winston Churchill. That there clearly is something, by the way, in British culture that has that Napoleon complex, that they know that they're a tiny little weak, impotent country. Their empire was smashed into little pieces. They still like wear crowns and wigs and call themselves barons and baronesses and knight themselves and lords and all that. They still have all the trappings of this powerful empire, but they're just a tiny little irrelevant yapping country. And that's one of the reasons why this Churchillian rhetoric, they're always looking for how to prove they're Churchill. They love this. They live for these moments, these pundits and journalists in the UK, basically saying, if you don't favor risking nuclear war over Ukraine, you're basically like Neville Chamberlain. It's always 1930. The only thing they seem to have studied in school is this one moment in history of 1938. Everybody's Neville Chamberlain or Winston Churchill. Every act is tantamount to the Hitler invasion of Czechoslovakia or the demand for parts of it to be annexed. They don't know anything else in history, so they always resort right away to this. But British culture in particular is completely unhinged. That's why you heard that general. That's why you see this columnist speaking this way, because the more powerless you feel, the more you need to compensate with this kind of unhinged war rhetoric. Speaking of that, here is another British commentator, James O'Brien, whose show, his podcast or radio show appears on the LBC, the Leading Britain's Conversation. That's the acronym. Here's what he said today. Listen to how casually he calls for or wonders why we're not over there fighting the Russians.
Right. But right now, it is worthy of all the 1930s parallels that we fight shy of making at other points. We have a murderous criminal army at the behest of a despotic, totalitarian dictator marching through Europe while the free world, as we still like to think of ourselves, despite recent events and despite, madnesses, like having a man in the White House until relatively recently who was a cheerleader for this, Putin. We are sitting on the sidelines. How long can that continue? And what would prompt engagement?
Now, again, you'll notice the only thing he knows is 1938, Czechoslovakia, Hitler. Everything's Hitler to them. He also, again, if he so aghast at the fact that we're just sitting by not fighting the Russians, given that there's a totalitarian despot and a criminal murderous army marching through Europe, just like Adolf Hitler did. Again, why is he in this LBC studio behind that microphone instead of in Ukraine at the behest of the Ukrainian government, picking up arms and fighting the Russians with weapons, not with TV shows or words in a London studio? I ask that just simply because it's very easy to claim that you're willing to risk everything and want to watch other people go to war. But if you really believed any of the things they're saying about how crucial it is to defend Ukraine and fight the Russian army and defeat them, they would be over there doing it instead of doing what they're doing. But just to underscore again how mainstream this idea is becoming, in addition to Congressman Kinzinger, here is another Republican member of Congress, a GOP Senator Robert Wicker, who, as the Huffington Post headline reflects, quote, calls for no-fly zone over Ukraine. The Mississippi Republican says, quote, a strong coalition of like-minded nations should step in and seriously consider this. Quote, Senator Roger Wicker, Republican from Mississippi, endorsed the idea of creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine amid the Russian invasion of the Eastern European country, which grows deadlier by the day as Russian troops lay siege to population centers. Clearly, in the absence of a UN resolution, which Russia would likely veto, a strong coalition of like-minded nations should step in and seriously consider this, Wicker told Huffington Post on Monday. Ukrainian officials are reportedly urging President Joe Biden and NATO to impose a no-fly zone over parts of the country as large numbers of Russian troops approach the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, but top White House officials have ruled out the idea. A no-fly zone would require implementation by the U.S. military. It would essentially mean the U.S. military would be shooting down planes, Russian planes, threatening the outbreak of a larger war involving the U.S., White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said on Monday. She went on, that is definitely escalatory. That would potentially put us in a place where we are in a military conflict with Russia. That is not something President Biden wants to do, Psaki said in an interview on MSNBC. Those are all the good reasons why that's not a good idea. The article concluded most Republicans also oppose the idea of sending U.S. troops into Ukraine. So again, it is worth recognizing that for the moment at least, this view is a minority view for sure, but it's much more mainstream than it was even 5 days ago or 3 days ago when Congressman Kinzinger first proposed it. It's the more mainstream it becomes, the more it will seem to people like a viable option. Now, it's not just, fly zone people are calling for, but other forms of much more aggressive intervention by the United States than I think most people expected. Here is Benjamin Wittes, a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, one of the leading anti-Trump Russiagators, obsessed with Russia for many years now, who tweeted simply, quote, regime change, Russia. And he went on to claim that he doesn't mean he wants the U.S. to go invade Moscow and Russia and organize it, but he wants the U.S. through all sorts of other means to help the Russian people engineer the overthrow of Vladimir Putin. Here is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, saying something very similar. Quote, just days ago, much of the world was focused on the unwanted prospect of regime change in Ukraine. Now the conversation has shifted to include the possibility of desired regime change in Russia. A week can be a long time in politics. Indeed, he's right. Imagine, this is really the main point that I'm urging people to recognize, what things are going to look like a week from now, after a week more of stories about Russians blowing things up and killing civilians. So much has changed in the discourse in just a week. Now, even this, just kind of like casually cheering for Russian regime change, is itself incredibly reckless, just like calls that the Russian economy be collapsed out of some warped sense to see the Russians suffering as vengeance. Again, the Russians have more than 6,000 nuclear-tipped missiles, the first or second largest nuclear stockpile on the planet. if you have regime change in Russia, you have no idea where that control over that stockpile is going to go and in whose hands it's going to fall and what their intentions are. And if you collapse the Russian economy and cause massive stability in a country with weapons this dangerous, you also don't know. And yet, again, there's this kind of thirst for vengeance and destruction and a satisfaction of our darkest and most visceral impulses that it's almost just like a craving for revenge is the primary overarching goal and not any rational geostrategic thought, which is very dangerous given the high stakes we're confronting. Now, the idea that the U.S. should do everything possible to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression and the Russian military is not something that got invented or put into the ether just this week. Quite the contrary. Despite all the claims that the Republican Party is pro-Putin, the Republicans did, most of the Obama years attacking Obama for being insufficiently confrontational to Moscow, for accusing him of not arming Ukrainians with lethal weapons and confronting the Russians in Syria by overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. And Obama's view was the same one as Trump's, which is we should try and get along with Russia and not confront them, especially over something like Ukraine, which is a vital interest to Russia, but not the United States. But many Republicans, the kind of mainstream militarists in the Republican Party, have long been demanding that the United States essentially commit acts of war to arm and encourage the Ukrainians to be more aggressive toward Russia. Here is a picture of Senator John McCain, Senator Lindsey Graham, both Republicans, and Senator Amy Klobuchar in a trip to Ukraine in December 2016. So after the 2016 election when Trump won, before Trump was inaugurated. And listen to Senator McCain and Senator Graham explicitly tell the Ukrainians that they're going to do everything possible to arm the Ukrainians, to give them money, to do everything possible to enable them to fight the Russians.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
Рік 2017 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
Our fight is not with the Russian people but with Putin.
Ми боремося не з російським народом, але з Путіним.
Our promise to you is to take your cause to Washington.
Наша обіцянка – це те, що ми вашу боротьбу доведемо до Вашингтона.
Inform the American people of your bravery.
Проінформуємо американський народ про вашу відважність.
And make the case against Putin to the world.
І покажемо про докази проти Путіна усьому світу.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
Now, I don't show you much of John McCain's statements because he spoke very low and it's difficult to hear, but he was basically echoing everything Lindsey Graham said. And there you see Amy Klobuchar dressed up in the colors of the Ukrainian flag 5 years before everyone on Twitter decided that was a very brave and noble thing to do. And she's kind of ahead of our time in that regard. And she was very much on board with this also. This idea that despite what President Obama said, that Ukraine isn't a vital interest to the United States, and therefore we shouldn't be spending lots of money and risking American lives and treasure in order to defend it, they were saying the opposite. They were saying way back in 2016, no, your cause is our cause. And we will do everything possible to make sure that you have everything you need from the United States to fight Russia. So this has been in the ether for a long time. Obviously, 5 years of Russiagate with the climate being created where it was inherently suspect and criminal, even treasonous, to even be seen talking to a Russian diplomat or a Russian official, constantly telling Americans that the Russians had taken over the United States, infiltrated the powers, the halls of power in the United States through blackmail, have been priming millions of Americans to view Russia as this grave threat. The rage toward Putin for the perception that he helped defeat Hillary Clinton and elect Donald Trump by itself is an incredibly sharp and incisive rage that has been simmering for a long time. And this is all of what has been what has exploded this week and what can continue to explode and likely will keep exploding. It's been a long time in the making. Now, as I said, we're only a week into the war, and we've just now reached the point where the true carnage is likely to start happening, where the true fighting is about to be unleashed. And the question then becomes, what that general raised is, how much will public opinion change in terms of wanting and even demanding that the West go confront Russia militarily? One point I think that's worth noting is there's already changes in public opinion. 3 weeks ago, polls showed that Americans overwhelmingly did not want the U.S. to play a major role in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It was only 21%. Another 40 or 50% said they want the U.S. to play just a minor role. Another 20 or 30% said no role at all. 20 or 30%. Now, though, according to Gallup, more than close to 60% of Americans across the parties view what's happening in Ukraine as a vital and direct threat to the United States. 85%, a huge increase, view Russia in a negative light. So public opinion through this propaganda has changed radically and quickly. What's going to happen a week from now when people feed on stories all day on social media about the kind of thing you see on the front page of the New York Times? Civilians, people who look like us, who live like us, who are European, being killed. This is a tweet from the senior editor of Lawfare, the blog of the Brookings Institution, Kinta Juricic, and she essentially raises this point. Quote, "The mood on English language Twitter has been so triumphalist around Ukraine. And to be clear, the scenes of Ukrainians standing up for their country are deeply moving. That I worry what happens on here if and when Russia starts to turn the tide by sheer brute force over the next few days." That is the narrative thus far, is the feisty Ukrainians have warded off Russia, are standing up to Russia. And that's kind of why we're telling ourselves that we don't need to go fight directly, because we're arming them, we're giving them money, and they're able to fight on their own. That's only because the Russians have been so constrained in their use of military force. They're going to become less constrained for sure. They already are today. And her point is, how are people going to react, having been led for a week to believe the Ukrainians have everything they need to confront the Russians once Russia just starts rolling over them? How many people are going to join in with Richard Engel and those British play actors, Churchillian play actors, and Representative Kinzinger and say, we can't sit by and watch this happen. We have a moral obligation to go use our military to protect the Ukrainians. Now, one key facet of all of this is that this is the first war that is primarily playing out on social media. A lot of you may not be old enough to remember that in 1991, when the United States fought to expel Iraq from Kuwait, that was really the birth of CNN, and the war was more televised than any war in history. And the United States government was releasing footage of what it claimed to be extremely accurate, quote unquote, smart bombs that were clinically aimed at the targets and not killing any civilians. And that was the birth of CNN, was covering that war. And it was the first war that was covered 24 hours on television, and it created a lot of popularity and support for that war. This is the first war being fought primarily over social media. There have been other conflicts where social media played a critical role. Every time the Israelis bomb Gaza now, we see all kinds of videos about the wreckage and the carnage that we didn't see previously from Gazans uploading cell phone videos. Certainly in Syria, there was a battle of propaganda. But in terms of like a major war between two large nations, this is the first war playing out largely over social media. And all the things we know about what social media does to people, to our emotions, to our groupthink, to our herd behavior, to our instincts, to keep us angry and engaged, it's now all being directed not into culture war battles, but into a very dangerous war. Here is an article in Spectator World by the right-wing writer, conservative writer Stephen Miller, not the Stephen Miller who worked in the Trump White House, but a much better Stephen Miller, who basically made this argument, quote, "The Ukraine invasion is the first social media war, and Vladimir Zelensky is its star." And this is what his argument was. And I think it's an extremely important one for understanding what's likely coming. Quote, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not only the largest European land conflict since the 1940s, it's also the first for the TikTok and the YouTube generation. As videos pour in across Twitter and Instagram and other social media platforms are leveraged for credit or propaganda, it's become evident that we are in a brand new era, much like the one that arrived with 24-hour cable news coverage of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 1990. Back then, it was grainy night vision images of Patriot missile launches and target explosions that dazzled homes all over the United States. Now, anxious audiences simply launch their favorite social media app on their smartphone to see the latest high-definition shelling of buildings in Kiev from Russian forces, or viral news clips of Ukrainians threatened, quote-to-quote, fuck some Russians up. That, I think, is a crucial component to what's happening, is social media has absolutely altered the way not just Americans, but because of its interconnectivity, people around the world are seeing this war. You're able to curate what you want to hear and the voices you want to hear or don't hear. You can block out all dissent. You can just feed all day on anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian messaging, block out anything that undercuts the view of the heroic Ukrainians defying the evil aggressors. And as a result, just feed on this emotion, this very satiating experience. And the more you do, the more engaged you become, the more enraged you become. That's the model of social media, is to keep your emotions as high as possible and therefore your rationality as low as possible. And I think that's been a major component. I actually really wonder what would have happened had Twitter and Facebook and Instagram been this predominant in the wake of 9/11, or even in the run-up to the Iraq War. I wonder, for example, if with the majority in the United States believing Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, believing all the propaganda about him, that the United States would go and attack him, whether Germany and France would have been able, with all of its citizens connecting to the same messaging, would have been able, instead of being German and French and listening to German and French outlets and their own idiosyncratic perspective, whether they would have been able to oppose the war in Iraq, or whether German and French leaders themselves would have opposed to it. You see, Switzerland and Sweden renouncing their decades-old neutrality to, in Sweden's case, send weapons, or in Switzerland's case, to freeze assets of the Russians, or in the case of the Germans, who have been very friendly toward Russia because of the history of those two countries being so frightening during the 20th century and the financial connections between them as well, suddenly turning on a dime as public opinion changed due to social media and arming the Ukrainians, something that would have been unthinkable for the Germans 6 months ago. So I really wonder also whether in the wake of 9/11, with all that rage and anger, but now being exacerbated on social media, I could almost see it possible that the United States would have had to nuke a country or two to satiate that rage. That just attacking Afghanistan and then Iraq wouldn't have been sufficient. Obviously, we'll never know, but I just invite you as a thought exercise to consider how that history would have been different had social media been pervasive then, but we can certainly see its effects now. Now, I want to go back to one of the things that general said, that British general, when he explained why he thought that the population, Western populations, simply won't stand for passivity or nonviolence. And what he said was, we're not talking here about Iraqis or Somalis or people in Yemen or Afghanistan. We're talking about, as he put it, quote, people who look and live like us, which means that the sense of empathy that we have for Ukrainians is so much higher because we can identify with them more since they're white and European than we're the people in the countries where we've been taught to view as uncivilized or undeveloped or more savage or barbaric, where war is almost more expected or where it's not as tragic. And again, there's a racist component to it, but to say that is not necessarily to condemn everyone thinking that way is racist. It's pointing out that that's how we instinctively have evolved over millennia to view the world and react to the world. We're tribal beings. And it's almost like a natural impulse that they're describing, but we've seen enough people unwittingly explain that this is how they see the war, people in journalism and government, that clearly it's obviously something at play when you ask yourself, why are people so fixated on this war and on what's happening to Ukrainians in a way they never have been to the victims of their own government's war in Iraq and all the other places I mentioned? And the general said it's because these are people who, quote, live and look like us. And this has been a point made by many other people. Here's Michael Knowles, the host of the Michael Knowles Show at Daily Wire, who said, quote, "It just occurred to me that this is the first major war between civilized nations in my lifetime. I think it's very much in the ether. Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, all the other places we've been bombing, those aren't civilized countries, so we don't really care enough or as much as what happens between civilized nations." Here is Lucy Watson, a correspondent with ITV News. Listen to how she explains why she's so extra upset about what's happening in Ukraine.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
It's Robert Moore.
This is not some primitive developing nation. This is civilized. These are civilized people. This is Europe. And you constantly hear people emphasizing that what's extra horrific and unthinkable is it's a war in Europe, as opposed to the Middle East or Asia or Africa. Here is probably the most graphic expression of this sentiment from Charlie D'Agata, a correspondent with CBS News. He ended up apologizing for this, but the fact that this is how he was thinking about it is very revealing. Listen to what he said.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that.
The same themes over and over. So you have to believe that these experienced journalists who end up saying this stuff are just simply conveying what is in the minds of a lot of people, explicitly or otherwise, about why they're so jacked up about Ukraine and Ukrainians. Now, as I said, he did apologize, but for saying that they're more civilized than Iraq and Afghanistan. But honestly, I was not even sure he should have, since he did a public service in revealing the actual mindset by speaking truthfully as he sees it. Here is an anchor on Al Jazeera, Peter Dobby, who said something very similar just a couple days ago. Listen to him.
Now, as you're talking to us, Matthew, we're playing in the latest pictures of some of the refugees trying to get on trains or trying to get out of Ukraine. And what's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live.
It just speaks for itself, doesn't it? Here is a writer for The Telegraph, a centrist British newspaper, Daniel Hannan. Quote, "They seem so like us. That is what makes it so shocking. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations that can happen to anyone." So I point this out not to denounce these people. You can form your own views on that, but to simply say that this is very real and very pervasive. And I think it makes everything a lot more dangerous. The fact that people do connect to these war victims much more so than most war victims, and therefore are far more willing to risk more just irrationally. This is happening on the subconscious level through our tribalism than they would in any other war. Now, what's going to get really dangerous is, as that general said, as we sit one more day, 2 more days, he predicted by Thursday or Friday, once we see how much civilian casualties there are, how much carnage and destruction there is, that is going to exacerbate and stimulate this sentiment even more. And that's why I think this front page of the New York Times is so important. This is all we're going to see from now on. Civilian toll rising in rocket attacks, major strikes in major cities, 600,000 refugees. This is what now is going to be the story of the war. And when you combine that with the extreme amounts of empathy for the reasons I just showed you, you can easily see people starting to look at what a lot of these people are advocating with no-fly zones and saying they're right. We can't just sit by and watch this happen day after day. Here's also from the New York Times today, just to underscore the imagery, live updates, explosions shake Kiev in Ukraine's second largest city. And they're showing video, showed what appeared to be a rocket striking in front of an administration building. At least 7 people were killed. In Kiev, the capital's main TV tower was hit by a projectile. Now, I want to just briefly remind you of what President Obama said in 2016 when pressed by the neoconservative editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, about why he wasn't doing more to confront the Russians in Syria and in Ukraine. Because this is, again, 2016, so after the Russian annexation of Crimea, that followed a referendum where 95% of the people voted to join Russia or to be independent of Crimea. Lots of people say that referendum was invalid because Russian troops were occupying Crimea, which is true, but nobody doubts that the vast majority of people in Crimea preferred to be part of Russia as opposed to especially the new government installed in 2014. In Ukraine, it doesn't make it justifiable, and the West viewed it as unjustified, but that's what makes President Obama's emphatic views about how to think about Ukraine all the more striking, that even after the Russians annexed Crimea in 2014, this is still what he was saying. And this was President Trump's view as well. Even though if you say any of this now, you'll be instantly declared a Kremlin apologist or pro-Putin. That's how repressive the discourse is. This was from an article in April 2016, and it was entitled The Obama Doctrine, signifying that it really wasn't one of the most in-depth looks into Obama's views of the world and the principles he used to make hard foreign policy decisions. And here's the section where they asked him, Jeffrey Goldberg did, why aren't you doing more to protect Ukraine by confronting Russia? Quote, Obama's theory here is simple. Ukraine is a core Russian interest, but not an American one. So Russia will always be able to maintain escalatory dominance there. Quote, this is Obama speaking, the fact is that Ukraine, which is a non-NATO country, is going to be vulnerable to military domination by Russia no matter what we do, Obama said. I asked Obama whether his position on Ukraine was realistic or fatalistic. Obama said, quote, it's realistic, but this is an example of where we have to be very clear about what our core interests are and what we are willing to go to war for. And he's essentially saying Ukraine is not important enough to the United States to go to war with Russia in order to defend it. Here's the second part where Obama got kind of aggressive, and he said about the attacks on him for not being sufficiently confrontational, quote, now, if there is somebody in this town that would claim that we would consider going to war with Russia over Crimea and eastern Ukraine, then they should speak up and be very clear about that. The idea that talking tough or engaging in military action that is tangential to that particular area is somehow going to influence the decision-making of Russia or China is contrary to all the evidence we have seen over the last 50 years. This is the position of Donald Trump as well, when he ran for president in 2016, urging that we not see confrontation with Russia, but cooperation. And in fact, even though Trump was routinely called a puppet of Putin, he actually was more confrontational with Moscow than Obama was. He did send lethal arms to Ukraine, a lot of it, whereas Obama wouldn't. He also did everything he could to sabotage the Nord Stream pipeline, the most important project of Russia. So with the two most vital interests to Russia, Ukraine and the pipeline, Trump worked against, which should have immediately made the media stand up and acknowledge that the conspiracy theory they had spread for 5 years that Trump was controlled by Putin was a complete fiction in the deranged conspiracy theory and fairy tale. They stuck to that narrative, but both Obama and Trump had the same view of Russia, which is it's in our interest to cooperate with them and we shouldn't go to war with them over places like Syria and Ukraine. And yet now, no one can say that. It's taboo. It's considered pro-Putin or pro-Kremlin propaganda. I still thought Obama was right when he said this in 2016. I still think so now. And I think it's worth considering what he's saying when thinking about how dangerous the current climate is in demanding increasingly that we do more to intervene in Ukraine. Now, just to conclude, I want to point you to what some of you might know about already, but many of you probably don't, which is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I think there's a very dangerous tendency that I know I share to think that bad things just aren't going to happen. It's probably necessary for our sense of security. No, a lot of people thought it was impossible that Russia would invade Ukraine just because before a war happens, it's impossible to imagine a war breaking out like that. And yet it did happen. And I think a lot of people think, and you see it in some of this commentary, look, theoretically, of course, there's a possibility that Russia would use nuclear weapons, or the United States would if we got involved militarily, but I just don't believe that's realistic. Why would Putin do that? So look at what happened in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That began when Cuba, to use the terminology used for Ukraine, a sovereign country, invited and requested that the Russians place nuclear weapons on Cuban soil as a deterrent against future U.S. attempts at invasion. This followed the Bay of Pigs invasion, the failed U.S. attempt under John Kennedy to invade Cuba. And the Cubans were obviously concerned that they were going to try again. The CIA was. They were going to try and assassinate Castro, engineer regime change. And so they asked Russia to put nuclear weapons in Cuba as a way of warding off future invasions. And you'll be unsurprised to learn that the attitude of Washington was not, oh, look, Cuba's a sovereign country. They can invite any country they want or any weapons they want onto their own soil. That's just two sovereign countries doing what they want. No, that was not Washington's response. Washington viewed this as incredibly threatening to American national security. And President Kennedy ordered a blockade of Russia, preventing any ships from entering Cuba to punish them and try and suffocate them and isolate them in order to force these Russian nuclear weapons out. And Russia had sent a submarine to lurk off the coast of Cuba, and the Americans found it, detected it. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the submarine was armed with tactical nuclear weapons, which sounds limiting, but the nuclear weapons the submarine had on board, because it was 25 years after the first usage, was roughly the same size as the nuclear bomb the United States dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, killing hundreds of thousands of people and creating generations of people suffering from radiation poisoning. An incredibly explosive and devastating weapon, nuclear weapon. And when the Americans found that submarine, they began dropping bombs around it to explode and scare the submarine into feeling like they were being besieged. But the commanders of the submarine misperceived the intentions of the United States, which is often possible in a war zone. And they didn't think they were missing on purpose. They thought they were trying to hit the submarine, but were just missing and getting closer and closer. And so the two commanders on board that Russian submarine decided, they made the choice, not considered, they committed to detonating the tactical nuclear weapon they had on board against all the U.S. ships surrounding them, which obviously would have caused major damage, not just to Cuba, but to South Florida and large parts of the United States, including with radiation. That choice was made and was minutes away from happening. Minutes. And had that happened, had the Russians used a nuclear weapon against the United States, obviously the United States, which was already on high nuclear alert, like Russia is now, would have used nuclear weapons against the Russians. Probably would have bombed Moscow and major cities with nuclear-tipped missiles aimed at those cities, which in turn could easily and probably would easily have caused the Russians to launch a second strike and a retaliation and cause nuclear conflagration. That's how close we came, minutes away. And this National Geographic article from March of 2016 tells the story of Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, who is widely credited with averting nuclear war. This young Russian commander who had the same authority as the two submarine commanders who had ordered this nuclear attack, he intervened and said and argued, no, the Americans are not trying to blow you up. They're missing on purpose. They're detonating bombs around you as a warning to tell you to ascend onto the surface of the water. And therefore, there's no justification for using nuclear weapons against you because they're not trying to explode your submarine. And he prevailed. He convinced them to reverse their decision to use nuclear weapons. And as a result, he is credited with averting nuclear catastrophe. We came minutes away, due not to intention, but to misperception about what American and Russian intentions were, which can easily happen in a war zone. So if your attitude is to look at all these people, these sociopaths and maniacs, mainstreaming the idea of a no-fly zone or direct military confrontation with Russia, and you want to tell yourself, oh, don't worry, I get the risk theoretically, but there's no way countries would actually go to war with nuclear weapons when each side has them. They know. Just look at this history. This is not the only time we came close to nuclear weapons exchanges, but it's the best documented one. It's very possible. We see already after 1 week of war how much ideas have escalated, how much the discourse has intensified. And as this goes on, it's very easy to see how that could get worse. So I think the main purpose, again, is to look at the discourse. And even if you're somebody who is absolutely convinced that the Western consensus is the right one, that Russia is clearly the party to blame, that Putin is an evil, maniacal, murderous despot, that what's happening in Ukraine is somehow in another moral category than what the U.S. did in Iraq. I'd love to hear that argument, but let's assume that you're one of the people who believe that. Even if you're somebody who believes all those things, it's still incumbent upon you to use your faculties of reason to be very wary of anything that could lead to results driven by unconstrained emotion or a desire, like in the UK, to relive past glory and to compensate for insecurities about potency and masculinity, or to want vengeance or to feel strong. And all these instincts that are incredibly dangerous, we're very close to having them explode in ways that, if they do further, will be well beyond our control.